welcome everyone to this morning session, which will include the presentation by Juan Pablo Scarfi about his book, which is entitled "The Hidden History of International Law in the Americas: Empire and Legal Networks." I'd like to start by introducing my fellow panelist, Juan Pablo Scarfi, a PhD research associate at the Argentine National Scientific and Technical Research Council, CONCIET, and he currently teaches international relations and international law at the School of Politics and Government at the National University of San Martin, Argentina. Liliana Obregón is a professor of law at the University of Los Andes, and she holds an MA from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, also has a doctoral degree in the same university, and all for that we all very well known and was presented yesterday as is a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor, Michael D. Kirby Chair of International Law, and Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Australian Laureate Fellow at Melbourne Law School. So since we don't have too much time, then I would like to say just one first thing that, well, I'm José Manuel Álvarez. I am from Externado University, which we're going to host this event tomorrow. I work in the Economic and Law Department. And when I first saw the Juan Pablo's book, it was this year in the beginning of the year in April in the ASIL conference in the American Society of International Law. I was very, very happy of that. And at that point, I can remember that I sent a picture of his book in the shelves and went to celebrate this happening of this event. And I was with a colleague from Bolivia, and we decided to celebrate with an Argentinian wine. So I sent the picture with the Argentinian wine and the book. It happened to be that it spilled over a little bit of wine, but still you can sign it for me by this. Yeah, okay. So, okay. No, in this university it's forbidden, but we will have it tomorrow at night in Externado. Okay. Okay, so just Juan Pablo, start with your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, José Manuel. And well, I just want to say that it is a unique opportunity to be able to present my book in the context of this conference, especially because it's a unique opportunity that we could bring together and offered Martti Koskoniemi and Antoni Angi. And this special setting for me is really very appropriate in the sense that I think two questions that the book addresses are at the center of this conference, which had to do with rethinking international law from Latin America and from the Americas, and also the question of imperialism and international law, which is also a great concern of this book. I cannot think of a better setting for presenting this book, so thank you for this opportunity. So it is also an honor that Anne offered and whom I have seen at the Junior Faculty Forum in International Law recently in Nottingham, and she commented on my paper as well, and also more recently in Melbourne in a very interesting conference on revolutions and the impact of revolutions in international law. And also an honor that Liliana Obregón will be commenting on my work, who was about to be the examiner of my thesis, but in the end she wasn't, so it's an honor that she's going to be commenting on my book. I became interested I just want to say a few things about how I became interested in this subject, and also then, about the main subject of the book, of course. Also the approach and the main arguments of the book, which I think, and then I will of course give the the word to the commentators, and we have I think, a kind of informal conversation. I became interested in empire and international law and legal networks back in 2005 when I started to write a master dissertation. And I was especially interested in James Brown Scott's reading of Francisco de Vitoria's work, and to comparing colonial and post-colonial international legal visions of, or international legal and political visions of empire. So post-colonial empires and colonial empires. So I meant to write a comparison of that, but in the end I ended up becoming more interested in the fact that James Brown Scott was also a prominent figure in constructing a continental legal networks of international law in the Americas, and also a very important imperial thinker of international law who had an influence and engagement with many Latin American international lawyers, including Alejandro Álvarez, Antonio Sánchez de Bustamante, Carlos Savera Lamas, Luis María Drago, among others. So that's how I ended up, and this eventually led, this first approach, which was a master thesis, led eventually to my first book, El Imperio de la Ley, James Brown Scott y la construcción de un orden jurídico interamericano, the Empire of the Law, James Brown Scott, and the construction of Inter-American Legal Order, published in 2014 by Fondo de Cultura Económica. And it was through that process, there were 3 readings that influenced me at that time, and I want to mention them because I think there is a bit of a revival of this in the fact that this book was published in a series that one of the editors is Anthony Pagden. And one of the books that influenced me greatly at that time was Spanish Imperialism and Political Imagination. Was a very important work, and I thought I should write the chapter that wasn't written about the 20th century informal empire of United States in Latin America. But also a work that influenced me at the time was Christopher Rossi's work, A Broken Chain of Being, the book on James Brown Scott, and also James Brown Scott dealings with Vitoria, and also a book that influenced me at the time was Martin Kosciuszko Gentle's Civilizer of Nations. And also Tony Young's Imperialism, which was both were very important influences at the time, but especially Martin Kosciuszko because that book dealt with the Institut de Derecho Internacional, and I ended up working on the hemispheric branch of this, which meant to be an Institute for International Law for the Americas. So I meant to be an emulation of that institute, and this book covers that. And also, it meant to be an emulation, but something especially devoted to understand what was international law for the Americas. And if it was a special kind of international law for the Americas. This was the first kind of encounter with international law, and I think after writing this book, The Hidden History of International Law, Empire and Legal Networks, I think some of the concerns that began interest me when I wrote this first thesis, master thesis, the question of legal networks was crucial and became crucial in this second book, but also the question of empire. So I think those two notions were at the beginning of my research on these issues. But I progressively in the last few years, and especially since I began to engage more with international lawyers and with political scientists and intellectual historians, I sort of became more interested in the relationship between history and theory of international law, which happened to be interesting that my book was published in a series of the history and theory because I became more interested in the connections between history and theory. And especially, I became more concerned about the limits of international law as a tool for political and legal change and for the moderation of power, hegemonic imperial relations of power, especially between the United States and Latin America. So I'm going to say a few things about the book, the subject of the book, and that's, in a way, how to engage more with the work of Anne, asking me these questions about theory and history and critique. So the history of international law can be seen as the history of empire, but also can be seen as the history of hemispheric, continental, regional appropriations of international law. I think this book has these two dimensions that are interlinked together. The hidden history of international law offers a history of the deployment of international law for the legitimization of US hegemony in the context of the emergence of the US as an informal empire in the Americas and the origins of the so-called inter-American system. The book explores, and this has to do with some of the comments that Marty Kosciuszko made yesterday, this book deals with people and projects. And especially with James Brown Scott and Alejandro Álvarez. And the book explores, to some extent, the encounter, mutual understanding, but also separation between these two prominent lawyers, James Brown Scott and Alejandro Álvarez, who were both the founders of the American Institute of International Law, which was a hemispheric institution that brought together all the national societies of international law of the continent, but the model on the basis of which this organization was based was the American Society of International Law, which was the first one that was constructed in the Americas, and all the societies meant to emulate that one. And of course, the American Institute of International Law was based in Washington, D.C. first, then it was meant to change to Cuba, as I would tell, and as is addressed more explicitly in the book. But essentially it was funded by the Canning Endowment for International Peace. And that's also a question that about which the book deals, the importance of the third sector for understanding also the importance of international law in that period. So the book concentrates on the golden years of the of Pan-Americanism and U.S. informal empire and the sequence of interventions that have been taking place in the early 20th century until the 30s. And more especially, as I said, the trajectory of this organization, the international legal thought of Álvarez and Scott, and also the construction, development, and codification of international law in the Americas. Also, the book explores the international legal thought of a series of US and Latin American international lawyers, including Luis María Drago, Antonio Sánchez Bustamante, Elio Ruth, Víctor Mauro Túa from Peru, Carlos Adera Lamas from Argentina, among others. The main argument of the book, and this is addressed in the beginning or in the introduction of the book, is that American international law, as advanced by the American Institute of International Law, was driven by US-led imperial aspiration of civilizing Latin America through the promotion of international rule of law. And some of these arguments are also drawn on the fact that I concentrate on doctrine, but I was more interested in exploring how the language of international law found, as I said, important limitations for moderating US hemispheric hegemony and promoting power balancing in the Americas. And rather than concentrating on the ideologies, I mean, of course, there's a lot about the liberal international ideologies of James Brown Scott and Alejandro Álvarez and their different approaches to international law, and there's kind of a comparative analysis on that. But I paid a lot of attention also to the choices and the alliances that Scott built through the history and the evolution of the American Institute of International Law. He basically began to displace Álvarez from the organization and began to engage with Cuban elitist and conservative international lawyers who were supportive of the Platt Amendment that gave the right of intervention to the United States in Cuba from the early 20th century until 1934. And these were Antonio Sánchez de Bustamante and Cosme de la Torriente. So I concentrate on those choices and strategies and alliances, as well as the ideologies, and that's why in a way this is a hidden history of international law, and that's why the title makes sense, because the book unveils the hidden beliefs which were ethnocentric, elitist, hegemonic, and the civilizing aspirations of the organization, especially oriented towards the deployment, extension, and Pan-Americanization of the U.S. legal and political model as a standard of civilization for the Americas. So in terms of the approach, I'm going to say a few things about interdisciplinary questions which have been dealt extensively in the conference, and many interesting things have been said already. But I can just say, and I definitely agree with Anne, the remark that she made, there's no answer in another discipline, and I think this book is mainly a history of international law in the first place. But also is an interdisciplinary work that engages with a comparative legal and political theory, but also with intellectual history and global history. And also, one of my examiners suggested that it's a kind of sociologically oriented, there is a kind of sociologically oriented intellectual history here, in the sense that I also draw on the work of Bourdieu, but it's not hard theory here. It's a very kind of a flexible approach to theory, I would say, in the sense that I don't apply models as it were, as rigid models to the story I'm telling here. And what else I wanted to say is that, well, and so a few things about this group and the liberal visions that they shared. I'm doing okay with the time. Okay. Okay, fine. I'm going to finish in a second. So the group of international lawyers are also diplomats and politicians who were engaged in the American Institute of International Law, believed in a series of shared US-led legal and political principles, and essentially there was a kind of a liberal internationalist legal vision that they shared. And of course, this also connects with the comments that Anne made of the different stages of the liberal tradition. And this early 20th century stage of the liberal tradition in the Americas is a very interesting one. I think it's dealt in the book, and on the extent to which this optimist about the progress of international law could bring together Latin American and US international laws, having very different visions about international law, very different traditions, common law tradition, a kind of Spanish, different kind of tradition, the Latin American one, more based on a French tradition to some extent as well. So Alvarez attempt to bring those two traditions together, and he had a Hegelian vision that the common law tradition and the Spanish-American tradition could bring together, and we could have some sort of Pan-American approach to international law, a very idealistic vision to some extent, but I think was very influential for many Latin American international lawyers throughout the 20th century. So this group of lawyers had this series of common beliefs and as I said, a liberal internationalist vision that both Scott and Alvarez shared. And there was a common ground, and this common ground had to do with all these lawyers from the US and Latin America shared a respect for the Monroe Doctrine. They believed that Pan-American solidarity and hemispheric peace were valuable. All of them as well respected and defended the Platt Amendment, or at least they never confronted the Platt Amendment explicitly. That gave, as I said, the right of the US to intervene on a regular basis in Cuba, and the Platt Amendment was, especially Article 3, was written by Elliot Root, and this has been also addressed yesterday in the second panel. And also they shared a concern for sovereign equality, at least a formal concern for sovereign equality, the condemnation of violent and arbitrary interventions, and the right to intervene to protect the lives and properties of foreigners located abroad. So, however, I mean, there was this common ground. There was a US-led and ethnocentric vision defended and deployed by James Francis Scott. And also Víctor Martú and Antonio Sánchez de Bustamante were supportive of this kind of ethnocentric vision, where the US model had to be deployed as the model for the Americas. And Alvarez, in contrast, defended a more solidarist vision, a multilateral one, and defending not an absolute non-intervention approach to non-intervention, but a moderate approach to non-intervention. So I think I stop here.
So thank you. I would first like to thank the Universidad del Rosario and Juan Pablo for asking me to comment on the hidden history of international law in the Americas. And as Juan Pablo mentioned a few minutes ago, I was asked to be his opponent in the dissertation, the defense a few years ago at Cambridge University. And unfortunately, because of a few bureaucratic incidents or whatever, I was not able to go. So that makes me very happy to be able to be here on an even better occasion, which is his final product of this book. And I was also thinking that I'm here because of envy. I am very envious of this book because it's the book that begins where I left off with my authors of the 19th century and early 20th century, and where I'm beginning to work again now after 1948. So as most or all of the Colombians in the audience should know, and I've been telling our guests, the 9th of April of 1948, when we had the murder of Jorge Eliezer Gaitán a few blocks from this university, the 9th Pan American Conference was being held, and the representatives of the Pan American Conference had to flee to the north to El Gimnasio Moderno, where they finally ended up founding the Organization of American States. So Juan Pablo's history ends where that moment begins. So it's a transition into the Cold War, because the first declarations or resolutions of the 9th Pan American Conference, or the OAS actually at that moment, were anti-communist and were connected to the events in Bogota as looking at it as a world issue, not a Colombian, as we see it mostly as a liberal, conservative conflict, I guess, but rather as the imposition or the entrance of communism into the region, and the United States wanting to avoid that. So it does have that moment here has that continuity with Juan Pablo's history, or the information and the facts that he studied, because it makes that obvious that the U.S. imperialism at the OAS conference continued. It wasn't a new thing. It continued right into the second half of the century. So I thank you for that, because that's a great story. And also this period in between, where I left off and the Cold War era is so rich, because all of these authors, I've studied them very superficially, but you managed to make all of the connections of their interactions personally, politically, right? Their ideological positions. And so I think that's a very rich and a very great contribution. And we were the other day with Anne in my office, and I was showing her the books from many of the authors that you cite that were rescued from the collection of Jesus Maria Yepes. And I was showing her that, they all autographed each other and read each other's books, and they knew each other very well. So let's say the bright side or the good side was that there was a huge discussion and a huge academic production at that time of their positions, if you agreed with them or not, but there was a lot going on among them. And I think maybe today we're not as sophisticated in that interaction as they were, right? So I wanted to really highlight that you were able to bring that out in the book, and it's very important for us to have that narrative of what happened and how they were discussing. My other observation on Juan Pablo himself is that he's an incredibly prolific writer, because at a very young age, he's already finished his doctoral dissertation in 2014, and this book is a product of that dissertation. But he also already has another book in Spanish, which I recommend very much, that's a product of his master's dissertation. So so he's an exemplary student because in a few years he's published 2 books in prestigious editorials. The first book actually is called El Imperio, la Ley, James Brown Scott y la construcción de un orden jurídico interamericano, el Fondo de Cultura Económica, which for us is also a very prestigious editorial. So that you're on a great path to more production in this field. And you're also co-editor of the book Cooperation and Hegemony in U.S. Latin American Relations, Revisiting the Western Hemisphere Idea. So there is a consistent theme that seems to have been worrying you is that you cannot have a history of Latin America and international law without the United States. Like it's the hegemon, it's the empire, it's the present that we have to deal with in the region, and Juan Pablo has very carefully studied that. And all of these publications, like this book, are thoroughly researched and theoretically grounded and fill a major gap in the literature on the history of U.S.-Latin American relations and the intellectual history of international law. But I would also say that this book is precisely relevant in its relation to the discussions we had yesterday on imperialism and of course today on history, and therefore and also to the current situation of U.S.-Latin American relations, if there are any at all, because the way things are going, it seems like the relations are all based on the ideas of one crazy person. So Juan Pablo's work shows this hidden history, and I'm glad you clarified what the hidden history was, because when I read the title, like, what is the hidden history? Because some of these things I already knew, like, yeah, we knew of the founding of the American Institute, we knew of Alvarez, we knew of James Brown Scott, we knew of all of these guys, but I think the hidden history is that we didn't know the complexity and the debates and the tensions that were behind the lines of this nice progress narrative that we've been taught in the past by our 20th century authors who discuss this history of Latin American international law. So they've told us the nice version that, first we have these authors from Bello to Calvo to Alvarez, and then we have the institution building, and we have the Inter-American system, and finally the great, Inter-American system of human rights that is a product, the OAS. So it's a very nice progress narrative, and I think you've managed to challenge all of that. So in that sense, I also congratulate you. So on the one hand, Juan Pablo's account tells us that part of the known history of the Institute's founders and how their relation and encounters with other jurists of the regions led to develop many of the founding principles of Pan-Americanism and Latin American international law hailed by our 20th century colleagues, such as non-intervention, solidarity and hemispheric peace, condemnation of aggression, and sovereign equality. On the other, Juan Pablo shows us that the hidden histories of these interactions is on one side that the U.S. and Latin American leaders did not question U.S. hegemony and interventionism, making them, as Juan Pablo says, using Marti's term, the gentle civilizers of the Americas, through the promotion of a U.S. legal and political model and the language of international law. This might be obvious observation today, but the Pan-American ideals have mostly been highlighted as narratives of success and progress in the past literature. Juan Pablo manages to link the individual ideas and practices of the Institute's main figures with its institutional history and the hemispheric power politics and hierarchical relations. So I just wanted to finish with the last session that we had, and it feels like Juan Pablo was this, I don't know, how would you describe it, like a student, such a good student that he was in the last session. He went back, and during the break, he wrote the perfect book to answer all of the, the comments and questions that were made, or suggestions that were made in the last session. So I just took some quick notes. So for example, he is very aware of Marty's comment of the past as present, right? And I think, and a question I would ask you is, now from your view of, or this book, how are you seeing U.S.-Latin American relations, international relations, or relations with the U.S. through international at this moment? You know, how does this study that you did help you interpret what is going on, or is it such an exceptional moment that it doesn't help at all? I mean, it would, but I would love to hear your view on that. I think also he took Marty's cue on reading the original text. So many of the studies that I've read on Latin American international law are like we would say in Spanish, refritos, like plagiarism of what the previous guy said, and nobody reads the original text. So Juan Pablo did that. He went and read the original text, and that is why I think your book is so interesting, because you went back and did your homework on that. I also, another thing that I think he took from Marty is the question of power. So it is completely about the power relations and how the lawyers in the region manage these power relations, also with respect to the United States. So how they deal with the United States, and the figures that are representing the United States, and then how they try to also make their own moves to manage that imperial force in the region, which they are, how would you say, they comply with, but at the same time challenge. You know, it's very complicated in that sense. And from Tony, I think he took the comment on the language of the colonized. Like so the Latin American internationalists are embedded in the colonized language of the international law, but at the same time trying to make their own vocabulary, their own principles, their own. So they know they have to use this language, and it's the only language they have, but they're trying to push the borders of it. And I also think he took Tony's suggestions on the microhistory. So he does have a work on root, and he has a chapter. So he went and did that homework during the break. He's really quick, yeah. And he avoids a homogeneous idea of regionalism, which I think you also mentioned in and breaks with the story of progress, the progress narrative. He also does that, so I think that's fascinating. And finally, I know Anne is going to speak more, but I think from Anne, he took the idea, the importance of conceptual history, and how to follow concepts and how they play in these power politics, especially with the notion of non-intervention, which you're very interested in. So I guess with that, I'll stop there, but congratulations once again for this really fantastic book. And I recommend everybody buy it and read it.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here to be able to contribute to the presentation of this book. I have, as Juan Pablo just mentioned, had the pleasure of reading his work earlier this year, I think, at the Junior Faculty Forum for International Law in Nottingham in May. So the new work he's doing on stressing histories of anti-imperialism in Latin America, and also to hear him present just a month ago in Melbourne, what world travellers we are, on the Mexican revolutionary international lawyers and Foreign Minister. And I really look forward to seeing that paper develop. And it was a delight to read this book. And indeed, as I think as Liliana suggests, it does have a conversation with the previous session. And I feel where particularly I expressed some reservations about interdisciplinary encounters when they don't go so well, here I would say I'm going to have a great time explaining why I think such rich contextual studies can be extremely relevant and useful for international lawyers. But I will also suggest some ways in which we would think about how some of the debates that are so beautifully contextualized and set out here actually move forward into the current era in a way that right at the end, the book, I think, seems to suggest something other. So I'll explain why I would make the argument I'll make right at the end. But to say a little more about what the book does and why I think it's incredibly rich for international lawyers. So as you've heard, the ambition is to consider the distinctive hemispheric discourse and practice of American international law, broadly conceived, in the Western Hemisphere. And Juan Pablo says that there have been few studies, and I think this is a fair claim, that have considered the relationship between US hegemony, international law, and specifically how that relates to the place of Latin America and the inter-American system in a broader historical process of development of international law. So the book seeks to do this through exploring the development of continental legal networks, and here I think the influence of Marty is very clear through, for instance, the development of the American Institute of International Law and the specific jurists who tried to work through that institute until its destruction in a debate over intervention, sought to develop this regional network of lawyers. And this was also a project that was in many ways sponsored by philanthropic foundations. I think that's still a story that would be relevant to Latin America today and something we might talk about in the discussion. And so in particular, Juan Pablo looks at the ways in which the Carnegie Endowment sponsored and helped to support this activity. And there's also a focus on commercial expansion as going alongside this development. I think we could tell a whole other story about that through focusing, for instance, on the way in which some of these figures and the commitment to non-intervention also are complemented by the creation of trade and friendship treaties that then move into the GATT, so that form the basis of the GATT. But that would be, I think, a different story to the one that you're telling. And Juan Pablo then suggests that this is all relevant for understanding the broader history of the continent and US informal hegemony. I'm going to come back in a moment and suggest I think it's actually relevant even more broadly than a hemispheric story, but I think it's certainly true, at least to that extent. So the book then explores this through the rise of these continental legal networks, but then through a focus in particular on the way in which non-intervention is discussed, debated, contested, and in a sense codified through various forms. The Monroe Doctrine, attempts at codification after World War I, debates over intervention at various conferences, and then in the Montevideo Convention. So the book then, I think, opens up this important question about how we should understand these principles of sovereign equality, non-intervention, and legal cooperation as they operate throughout this history. So should we think about them as egalitarian, about the idealistic assertion of a new republicanism, a new republican form of government, as against, at least now we're talking in the 1820s, the concept of Europe-style interventions, and the approach of European monarchs. So should we think idealistically about this as a defense of republicanism in a particular region? And certainly if we look back to the Monroe Doctrine and the context in which it was enunciated, we could see that's one way in which we would want to read the implications of this doctrine. But the history that we see here, of course, suggests a shadow side to the doctrine, that we should understand it at the same time as an assertion of US hegemony in the region. And the question of what the Monroe Doctrine means and what the principle of non-intervention will mean in the region is one that divides the US within itself, and that also divides Latin American leaders amongst themselves and against or with, as it happens, the US. So this is a history that's just told in exquisite detail, I would really suggest that if you're interested in thinking about the history of non-intervention, therefore everyone who's working in Melbourne, you should certainly think carefully about what we're being shown here. So this helps us to understand a form of law that's still extremely important today, but it also suggests to us why this region might be a really important one for those of us who don't live here, and that's because it also is a place in which there's been a very long history of attempting to find juridical forms of resisting this informal, but often quite formal in some ways, forms of US imperialism. So although this focus is on the history, this history is relevant to what Juan Pablo says is the founding normative and institutional bases of the inter-American system. I actually want to argue that that's underselling it, but it's underselling it because of the contextual history protocols that you're committing yourself to so properly, but I'm going to say we could do something else with this. So what might we international lawyers do with this history? And I think the history is of far more interest beyond the inter-American system, precisely because of the way in which the movement is transmitted. And indeed, I would also say that this suggests how we might think about Schmidt as well, who comes in here briefly, came in yesterday, I think also in Christopher Rossi's presentation. I would like to just say something else about Schmidt's obsession with the Monroe Doctrine. But so there's 2 points at which you talk about other institutions. So the focus here is on regional institutions, and that's quite proper. But I think that this is a very important question for the meaning of collective security as it first appears in the League of Nations through Article 21, and then as the notion of collective self-defense in particular is taken up in the UN Charter. So for an international lawyer, this history in the mode of weaponization that we discussed earlier is a really important one for trying to think about the ways in which we're being told a story about collective self-defense today. And collective self-defense, if you don't have an interest in the use of force, collective self-defense is really the key concept that that's now being used to explain the practices of US use of force in the world today in the global non-international armed conflict, and the collective self-defense is precisely where this regional understanding is embedded. So we think it's embedded in the UN Charter in Chapter 8, but really it's embedded in this article on collective self-defense. So in the book at page 82 you say, well, this does find its way into Article 21 of the League of Nations because the US wouldn't join the League of Nations, and of course it didn't, but unless Article 21 recognised the centrality of the Monroe Doctrine to the US interests. And for the US, they allege, this was a policy of self-defense, not a policy of aggression. So of course we know already by the late 19th century that wasn't clear at all, but partly they said it was a doctrine of self-defense because it was a notion of an international police power. And that this extended even as far as protecting things like the Panama Canal, that the US had to be able to protect these new highways. And so when it sought to join the League of Nations, and in compliance with that long-standing foreign policy tradition, the US wouldn't abandon the Monroe Doctrine and it wouldn't submit the right to interpret it to anyone else. This was really key, and so at the insistence of the US drafters, the covenant was amended to include this article, which provided that nothing in this covenant shall be deemed to affect the validity of international engagements, such as treaties of interpretation or regional understandings like the Monroe Doctrine for securing the maintenance of peace. So there we are. So now we can spend a long time arguing what a regional understanding like the Monroe Doctrine would look like. Would it look like fascism? So would it look like the attempt to control greater spaces in Europe through a benevolent hegemon like Germany? Yes, says Schmidt, that's exactly what something like the Monroe Doctrine would look like. It would look just like that, and we can do that. Look, it's in Article 21. And colonial powers would say, well, yes, and we would organise space on a global scale through colonialism. That's just like the Monroe Doctrine, but bigger, like it's so the British Empire is just like the Monroe Doctrine, sort of. So German jurists such as Schmidt, but also other geopolitical thinkers like Rudolf Schellen and Friedrich Ratzel argued the nation state is too small to correspond to the 20th century's political and economic necessities. There must be a greater space. This is the only way we can map space in a meaningful sense onto energy economies, onto strategic interests, onto the relation of people to territory. The state is insufficient. We need a regional model. Surprisingly, many liberal international lawyers thought that was reasonable. So there was an enormous discussion in the 1930s about how to respond to what was seen to be a reasonable claim for non-colonial powers who needed more space to access raw materials and to address problems of metropolitan overpopulation. And this is all debated through the concept of peaceful change. And after World War II, you might think that these ideas of hegemonic expansion had been abandoned. And I think this is the ideology that we received, that after World War II we're living in a world of liberal states. But this became a really bitter discussion during the drafting of the UN Charter, and the US and Soviet delegations, as well as many Latin American republics, pushed to maintain regional defence arrangements in the text of the UN Charter. So this tension between universal and regionalism appears in Chapter 8, but it gives a very confined place for regionalism. There, still the Security Council gets to oversee regional organisations, and that was insufficient for the hegemons. So where it appears, where regionalism reappears is in Article 51. And so this was the complicated context in which regionalism finds its place again in the UN Charter. So when at the end of the book, Nico Critch says, well, the US has now abandoned international law, it's abandoned the UN Charter through this expansive idea of what it can do in terms of collective self-defense, I think there's something else to be said, and that is that here's the history of what's happening today. And if we think really hard about the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine, what is something like the Monroe Doctrine, we're going to see it's something like what the US is now playing out, but on a much bigger spatial scale.
Thank you for all these insightful comments, and I don't have. I think I have only. I'm gonna be brief, I think, because a lot of interesting things have been said, and I think there's a comment about the present, in which I would probably focus on, which Liliana touched upon and touched on her comments, and I guess that would pushed me to try to bring here to the table the extent to which this book has something to say about the present and the usages of all redefinitions of the Monroe Doctrine, redeployments of the Monroe Doctrine in the current context of the present. About Liliana's comment on the past and present of U.S.-Latin American relations. Well, I mean, one of the things there are two things that in which the book touches upon, and I think have important reverberations in the context of the present. One is the question of the obsession, because on the one hand, as I think very insightfully suggested, the Monroe Doctrine is still being deployed by the United States, or a kind of usage, contemporary usages of the Monroe Doctrine. But also, there's an obsession in the current context of the Latin American moving a step behind from inter-American institutions and sort of building new Latin American regionalist contesting sort of ideas. So the ideas of American international law and Pan-Americanism are being contested today. And interestingly, one of the articles I presented at the Junior Faculty Forum draw in the title on a phrase of Daniel, the president of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, who suggested that one of those Latin American regional meetings was meant to be an attempt to sentence the Monroe Doctrine to death. So basically, the obsession of Latin American politicians, international lawyers, intellectuals, I would say, very profoundly as well, public intellectuals, but also internationalists and foreign ministers today are obsessed still with the implications of the Monroe Doctrine and the fact that the Monroe Doctrine has to be contested. The other, I think that's one of the main, implications, and I think this obsession with the Monroe Doctrine has something to say about this move in the last 15 or 20 years of Latin America moving a step behind from inter-American institutions, to the extent that in the very critical context of Venezuela today, the fact that violations of what are the question of human rights in Venezuela addressed by the OAS is problematic in regional terms, and I think that's I think some of the questions that this book address, especially in chapter 3, about the implications of the Monroe Doctrine at the time and the extent to which for Latin Americans was such an influential doctrine that hasn't been considered, but began to be considered, especially when the story of the book finishes with the question of non-intervention. But a lot of critical international lawyers, which are mentioned in the book, but I haven't dealt with because it's about the American Institute, and I focus on those who were sort of supportive of the Monroe Doctrine or wanted to deploy the Monroe Doctrine differently as a multilateral doctrine, in the case of Alvarez, but Isidro Favela and other Latin American international lawyers began to criticize the Monroe Doctrine very early in the 1910s in the context of the Mexican Revolution, and especially in the 20s in the context of the Havana Conference in Cuba in 1928, where the debate of non-intervention and intervention begins to be sharp between Latin American international lawyers and internationalists and U.S. international lawyers, especially Secretary of State Charles Evan Hughes, who made a very controversial defense of interventionism in that conference. And that was contested by the Latin American delegations. So I think that story, the story about the different reverberations and interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine, including that one that was sort of challenging the Monroe Doctrine at the time when a lot of Latin American international lawyers were trying to deploy it as a multilateral doctrine, Drago and Alvarez essentially, has to do, it's telling something about this long-standing obsession of the continent with the Monroe Doctrine, and the implications for the present are clear in this kind of, the implications of that debate on a non-intervention has reverberations today, and that's part of that debate on non-intervention is covered in chapters 5 and 6 of the book, especially there a prominent figure is Carlos Saavedra Lamas, who's really assertive about the question of non-intervention, and I think in a way contributes to demolish the Monroe Doctrine to some extent, but again, the Monroe Doctrine revives and is contested. As you know, Reagan revived the Monroe Doctrine in the 80s, and well, as I said, Ortega challenged it very recently in this Latin American meeting. And the other question about the reverberations in the present have to do with also with debates about foreign companies and also the third sector and philanthropic foundations. I think this debate in these days was, it's interesting how Latin American international lawyers especially Alvarez, wanted to engage with the Carnegie, and especially, many of the books that Alvarez had written, especially the collection of essays that he collected on the Monroe Doctrine were funded by the Carnegie, was published by the Carnegie. And in those days, that wasn't challenged. But in the context of the early Cold War period, there were lots of controversies about the influence of the Ford Foundation on projects about marginality that were put together in Latin America to study questions of marginality and poverty in Latin America. And those projects funded by philanthropic foundations were subject of very controversial debates in the 50s and 60s. Especially was the project of marginality, in which José Nun was involved. There was a great debate about the extent to which it was problematic the fact that these projects were funded by the Ford Foundation. And I think these debates, have reverberations in the present, especially the attitude of Latin American countries more recently about foreign companies and philanthropic foundations has been more assertive. So we can see a process of kind of consciousness about the implications and the hidden projects that were behind these philanthropic foundations, and we can see a process of consciousness. And I think this conference, in a way, is sort of suggests that suggests that there is a kind of strong consciousness about these questions, and that's where we are rethinking international law. Very, very deeply concerned about questions of power, and if we are concerned about questions of power, philanthropic foundations and foreign companies are things to be taken very seriously, I think. And sorry. Okay, and then I have to deal with all these interesting comments. All I can say is that I thank really very much Anne for these very insightful comments on the implications on the present. I definitely think that the Monroe, it's very interesting how you sort of suggested how the Monroe Doctrine was implicated and had implications not just for the League of Nations, but also in the context of the UN Charter. And I think the debates covered in the book, I think, suggest that the notion that you put together on a collective self-defense has a lot of connections with the way in which the first invocations of humanitarian intervention that were deployed, especially, as I mentioned, by Hughes in the context of the 1928 conference, but also thinking of the Platt Amendment as a humanitarian right to intervene to save Cuba from being non-civilized and being subject to the risk of being conquered, or was also a way of defending Cuba for their own weaknesses. That was in a way the way that was defended by Scott in the context of the Platt Amendment, which was written and put together by Root, but there's a very interesting defense that Scott made of the Platt Amendment as a humanitarian doctrine that will save Cuba from its own weaknesses. And I think that has to do with the idea. It has connections with the idea of defending Latin American countries for their own weaknesses. And I think that invocation that was more unilateral in that context and in the current context doesn't appear to be very unilateral as it was in those days, but I think there's a strong connection there to be explored. I think I touched upon those things and the usages of the question of humanitarian intervention in the present, and how the extent to which the United States has attached itself to notions of humanitarian intervention in the present, and how has been the great global promoter of humanitarian intervention. I think the story I'm telling here of Scott being one of pioneering promoters of humanitarian intervention in Cuba, but also in the context of creating some sort of interdependence in Latin American countries, was also very influential to the extent that many Latin American international lawyers also draw on those notions as well. I stop here, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. We're a little bit over time, but I think we can have a session for just 2 questions, very short ones. Please, yeah, we'll have 2 questions, very short ones, and for very short answer. Go ahead. Okay.
Speak louder, please.
Chris Rossi, University of Iowa. Congratulations on your book. We have it in our library, and I've made good use of it. So, President Obama went to Cuba.
Yes.
And he praised Jose Marti. And people in Miami, when people in Miami and Havana are talking about the same person, you got to know they're talking about the person in different ways. So I'm wondering if you have a sense, given your book, where you make this story about the rise of Latin Americanism, and you counterpoise it with the rise of Pan-Americanism.
Yes.
When did that separation take place? Were you using those as tropes for a heuristic device, or is the lesson of Obama in Cuba talking about Jose Marti in ways that have the Cubans nodding their heads? Is there some overlap? In a very brief condensation of what I just said, if these are real ideas, when did they fracture or separate?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, that separation, I think I sort of try to suggest that the separation has to do with the fact that there's a strong separation between, I use these notions of the distinction between the legal field and the intellectual field. So basically, I mean, Martí is a figure that belongs to the kind of Arielista creed of Latin American thinkers and intellectuals, and there's a division in that regard. There are very few international lawyers at the time that would have a Latin Americanist vision at the time, drawing on Martí's vision. That was, I mean, the influence of Martí at the time was an influence among intellectuals, among politicians, but wasn't a strong influence among international lawyers. International lawyers were more influenced by these international Pan-American conferences, and I think most of them, I'm not saying everyone, because I have exceptions, and I have encountered a few exceptions, and I'm currently working on those exceptions. One is Favela, but there are others in Cuba as well. But essentially, there's a strong division between those who belong to the legal field, who are more attached to the field of power, and I'm drawing here on Bourdieu's work, and those who were in the intellectual field, and essentially Martí belongs to that field. That's why I was surprised to see that Martí had text on arbitration yesterday in Simon's interesting exposition. I was surprised to see that coming from Martí, but it's interesting. There's that division, and I think when Obama goes to Cuba, what he wants to say is, I like your traditions, because we haven't been aware of those. You have been such a critic of U.S. imperialist, Yankee hegemony, and Martí was one of those. So basically saying we like Martí is a gesture of an attempt to redefine the American approachment, reproachment to Latin America differently, because that didn't work, and that's why Daniel Ortega is saying we're sentencing the moral doctrine to death. We have to redefine how, I mean, all the attempt of Obama sort of bridging the gap with the Latin Americans in that context seems to me has to do with sort of demolishing. There was an attempt to demolish the old ghosts and create some sort of harmony by defending those who are phrased by the Latin Americans to defend themselves from the United States. So I think it's a gesture there that is an attempt to say something new, which in the end didn't work because Guantanamo wasn't closed. And I'll stop here, I think.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo and Liliana, and for your comments. And I please join Juan Pablo.